In 2023, a retired electrician named Calvin Drayton finds an old satchel in his Newark basement. It's labeled LHF Project 86. Inside are circuit diagrams, fuse schematics, and a Polaroid of cash that shouldn't exist. Nearly 4 decades earlier, $2.1 million vanished in a suspicious bank fire, with no suspects and no trace of the money. But now, with one dusty envelope and a few yellow annotations, the silence is breaking. The fuse that burned the truth may have just reconnected. At 4:43 a.m. on Saturday, August 9th, 1986, a Newark Fire Department engine was dispatched to a structure fire at 203 Brighton Street, the Lincoln Heights Federal Credit Union. The 2-story brick building was already engulfed when firefighters arrived. Flames had burst through the roof's northwest corner, and smoke billowed in plumes across the adjacent municipal parking lot. By 5:12 a.m., the roof had partially collapsed. By 6:03, the fire was declared under control. No injuries, no fatalities, but the building was a total loss. The fire's origin was officially traced to the main breaker panel in the utility corridor behind the teller line, a tangle of melted conduit and scorched drywall. The report listed the probable cause as electrical malfunction. That explanation satisfied public records. Internally, however, there were quiet hesitations. Veteran arson investigator Ellis Conroy noted that the heat signature and burn pattern didn't align with common failure events. One melted relay had been manually overridden, something that wouldn't happen on its own. Still, without concrete evidence of accelerants or malicious interference, the report stayed as written. But Conroy and his team flagged 2 other details. The first was the vault. When responders entered the building's rear through the service stairwell, they found the steel vault door wide open, not blown apart, not breached, simply open. Yet logbooks from the prior business day, Friday the 8th, showed it had been properly sealed at 5:59 p.m. Staff protocols required dual key verification and were always documented. No anomaly was recorded in the log. The second detail was harder to explain. The bank's alarm system, a Honeywell 4200 unit with both exterior and interior sensors, had not gone off. No dispatch signal. No motion alerts. But the fire panel wasn't simply disconnected. It had been turned off manually at the internal override panel near the utility closet, a system only accessible from inside the premises. Investigators documented that switch position in their photos. It was clearly flipped to standby, meaning someone had physically entered the building before the fire began, disengaged the alarm, and left no sign of forced entry. These discrepancies were noted, but without external triggers, a matching footprint, a broken lock, or eyewitness accounts, no one had grounds to deviate from the mechanical failure theory. Newark PD filed the incident as closed. Insurance adjusters followed suit, and in the weeks that followed, the charred bones of Lincoln Heights Federal were cleared away with little ceremony. No suspects. No formal inquiry. Just a line item in the city's fire response archive. And, beneath it, a vault that should have been sealed, quietly sitting open as smoke claimed what remained. 2 days after the fire, insurance adjusters from Midwest Mutual conducted a preliminary walkthrough of the site under the supervision of Newark Fire Marshal's office. The heat had warped the metal filing cabinets into curled, unrecognizable shapes. The teller stations were ash. The scent of scorched plastic lingered beneath the collapsed ceiling panels. But what concerned the adjusters wasn't what had burned, it was what hadn't. Midwest's policy on Lincoln Heights Federal included a clause requiring itemized declarations of high-value currency transfers. According to their ledgers, a delivery of $2.1 million in small denomination bills, mostly 20s and 50s, had been signed into the bank's internal register at 2:11 p.m. on August 8th. The funds were meant for weekend redistribution across affiliated branches beginning Monday morning. Staff confirmed the drop, initialed it, and reported that the money had been secured in the vault by day's end. But when asked if any of that cash had survived the fire, the bank's president, Carl Bouchard, shook his head. All of it was lost, he said. No metal lockboxes, no security bags, no trace of the bills. In a fire this severe, destruction was plausible. But even in high-temperature conditions, some fragment, a scorched canvas strap, a partially burned label, a melted zipper would normally remain. Yet nothing resembling cash containment materials was found in the vault or nearby debris. A report filed by the claims auditor noted the absence as unusual given expected fireproofing standards. Lincoln Heights Vault had been built to commercial compliance codes, rated to withstand direct flame exposure for over 2 hours. The fire had lasted under 90 minutes. Meanwhile, investigators revisited the alarm system irregularity. The override switch's position flipped inward and down could not have been triggered remotely. There was no sign of tampering from the exterior panels. Only someone with access to the interior hallway and knowledge of the breaker panel's configuration could have disengaged the alert. That person would have had to enter the building, disable the system, and depart or stay hidden until the fire began. But without signs of forced entry or surveillance footage, the camera system had been gutted and the blaze theories remained speculative. Ellis Conroy wrote in his personal log, "Vault open, alarm disabled, no break-in. If it walks like inside help, it probably is. But there's nothing to hold it on." The line was never submitted in the official report. Midwest Mutual paid out the loss in full by October. The building, deemed unsafe, was demolished before winter. What had briefly flickered as a possible case of internal theft, disguised as an electrical mishap, faded into clerical silence. No subpoenas, no charges. Just a building reduced to rubble and a vault that had opened not by force but by omission. The exact figure, 112,600, was entered into the Lincoln Heights Federal Ledger at 2:14 p.m. on August 8, 1986. The delivery came in 2 Brinks containers, each accompanied by an internal transmittal form and armored carrier receipt. The notation was routine, buried among a week's worth of deposits, withdrawals, and inter-branch cash flows. But it marked the last confirmed sighting of the money. The funds had been scheduled for redistribution to 3 suburban branch locations in East Orange, Irvington, and South Plainfield, all set to replenish weekend ATM reserves. According to procedure, large volume redistributions were to remain in the vault until the following business day. Records show that the bank's head of vault operations, Lorraine Keyes, signed the cash into storage just before closing. The vault door was locked at 6:02 p.m. No irregularities noted. When the fire consumed the building less than 11 hours later, the fate of the funds became a matter of insurance, not investigation. Carl Bouchard, the bank president, submitted sworn testimony that the entirety of the funds had been inside the vault at the time of the fire. No staff reported seeing the money removed. No withdrawals had been recorded. There were no outgoing transports, no late-night access logs, no known anomalies except, of course, for the fact that the vault was open when firefighters arrived. The vault itself had been partially shielded from the worst of the blaze. Its steel shell withstood collapse, but the interior had been blackened and cleared out by the time officials were allowed access. No currency was recovered, no security bags, no scorched remnants of shrink-wrapped bundles. The assumption was complete incineration, but forensic auditors quietly disagreed. Modern paper currency, when tightly stacked and stored within reinforced cash bags or steel trays, often leaves behind identifiable debris even after severe fires. Traces of ink, charred threads, heat-damaged plastics. In this case, there were none. The vault showed signs of having been emptied before the fire reached it. Its shelving units were clean of soot patterns associated with combusted contents. A fire-damaged shelf leaves a mark, an uneven burn, a shadow of what had sat there. The shelves were uniformly scorched. They'd been bare. Internally, Midwest Mutual filed the loss as suspicious but unprovable. In closed correspondence, their regional audit manager referred to the payout as a calculated write-off. Even if this was an inside job, there's no one left to pin it to. The building's gone, The tapes are gone. It's smoke now. With that, the matter dissolved. Lincoln Heights collected the full insured value. No criminal charges were filed. The Brinks manifests were archived. By 1987, the missing $2.1 million existed only as a ghost in the ledgers listed as destroyed in fire, absent any proof it had ever burned. By spring of 1987, the lot where Lincoln Heights Federal once stood had been paved over. The site, previously a modest two-story brick structure tucked between a bakery and a shuttered record store, became part of a municipal parking annex. No commemorative plaque, no public acknowledgement, just a number stenciled in white paint. Space 24. Inside the city's archives, the incident record was closed and microfilmed. One copy of the fire report was retained at the fire marshal's office. The insurance documents were sealed under confidentiality terms. Physical evidence, bits of scorched conduit, melted fixtures, and panel fragments had been photographed, bagged, and stored for a time at the precinct's evidence intake unit. But without an open case, the box was deaccessioned within 18 months. Items were either destroyed or repurposed into training material. The vault shelving once scrutinized for heat shadows was likely reduced to scrap, the names involved dispersed. Lorraine Keyes took early retirement in 1989, citing health stress. Carl Bouchard relocated to Florida in 1991 and died 2 years later of a stroke. Ellis Conroy retired from the fire marshal's office in 1997 and moved to Oregon. His notes on the Lincoln Heights fire, the personal ones, the ones that questioned the narrative, were never published or archived. Just one man's quiet doubts, logged in pencil margins, and now lost to time. As the years passed, the event lost urgency. Newark had its share of fires. The 1980s brought fiscal strain, political churn, and waves of reconstruction that altered the skyline block by block. The loss of a small community credit union barely registered against broader upheaval. No commemorative news pieces. No follow-ups. The $2.1 million, absent any public scandal or prosecution, became less of a mystery and more of a bureaucratic absence, one line on an old balance sheet that no longer balanced. In the city's collective memory, the fire faded. It became a non-event, known only to those who had worked the case or lost their workplace that morning. By the early 2000s, no one in the city's Planning and Compliance Division could name what used to stand on Brighton Street. The documents had aged out of the immediate recall cycle. The loss wasn't covered in textbooks or documentaries. Even those who had once wondered about the missing cash bank clerks, investigators, auditors had either moved on or passed on. And then, for more than 3 decades, nothing happened. No anonymous tips, no discovered bills, no resurfacing suspects. The fire remained what the record said it was. A tragic malfunction. It would take 37 years, a basement in disrepair, and a man cleaning out old tools to crack the silence wide open. In the summer of 2023, Calvin Drayton was 71 years old and facing surgery. It wasn't urgent, but the prognosis was clear enough. Spinal stenosis had made stair climbing difficult, and doctors warned he'd need a cane or worse if pressure on his lower vertebrae wasn't relieved. Calvin, a retired electrician who had once moved effortlessly through construction sites and utility shafts, didn't take the news lightly. His house on Ellington Avenue, a split level he'd lived in since 1982, had accumulated decades of tools, spare parts, and contractor debris. The basement in particular had become a catch-all for projects half-finished and boxes long ignored. That July, ahead of his procedure, Calvin resolved to start clearing it. He worked methodically, moving boxes of vinyl wiring, socket trays, conduit clamps. Much of it was obsolete surplus from jobs dating back to the Reagan years. He bundled what he could, filled contractor bags with rusted equipment, and stacked recyclables along the far wall. And then, Tucked behind a wooden spool of Romex cable and a milk crate filled with rusted junction boxes, he saw it. A waterproof satchel, gray and canvas, marked with black stenciling, LHF Project, 86. At first he didn't recognize it. The initials meant nothing until he unzipped it and found the building diagram's blueprint-sized paper, yellowed at the edges, each one stamped with the address of the Lincoln Heights Federal Credit Union. Electrical load charts, fuse layouts, a full breaker panel schematic annotated in black pen and blue grease pencil. Calvin stared at the sheets, tracing the circuits he himself had helped install back in late 1985, when the bank was nearing final inspection. He remembered the job. Not in detail, just that it had been a winter contract, subcontracted through Stokes Electrical Services. It had paid well. He had worked 2 weeks on site and moved on. That had been almost 40 years ago. But as he unfolded the larger pages, something gave him pause. Someone had highlighted parts of the wiring in yellow. They weren't his markings. The annotations traced specific override paths in the fire alarm circuitry connections between the vault panel and a subfeed routed through an auxiliary cutout marked RT27 keycut, Leon G. Calvin didn't remember that name. He had never signed off on anything with those initials. And yet the handwriting looked recent. It stood out. At the bottom of the satchel was a sealed manila envelope. Inside it, a Polaroid photograph, a duffel bag unzipped, stacked with bundled cash government bands intact, 20s and 50s, each bundle worn at the corners. The photo was time-stamped but faded. The background showed a linoleum floor Calvin didn't recognize. He didn't know who had placed the materials there or when. But something about it, the handwriting, the detail, felt immediate. It didn't feel like memorabilia. It felt like a warning left behind for someone who might one day notice, and Calvin had finally noticed. Calvin didn't call the police. Not immediately. The moment he found the photograph, his instincts, sharpened from decades of job site caution, told him something bigger was at play. The wiring diagrams weren't just old plans, they had been manipulated. Whoever had highlighted those paths understood how to bypass the bank's alarm system, and the annotations referenced a component that didn't appear in the original design he remembered. More troubling was the name. Leon G. It was printed in tight uppercase letters, scrawled beside the phrase RT27 keycut, a likely reference to a relay terminal or timed override circuit. But Calvin had never worked with a Leon. The crew on that job was small, union-backed, and tightly logged. He'd checked in, clocked out. No one by that name was in his memory. He laid the documents out across his basement workbench, smoothing them flat with a set of rubber-handled pliers. The photograph he left untouched. Just looking at the bag of cash raised questions he wasn't ready to answer. The edges of the photo were curled, but the image was clear. The bundles were real. So were the bank-issued currency straps. Calvin thought about the fire. It had made the papers back in '86, mostly as a footnote in local briefs. He hadn't paid much attention then. Fires happened, breakers overloaded. He'd been working another job by the time the building went up. But now he wondered if someone had used his work, his blueprints, to make that fire possible, and if they had, why leave the evidence with him? He tried to remember if the satchel had been his originally. It looked familiar, but only vaguely. Contractors often left gear on job sites. Tools migrated. Bags changed hands. Maybe someone had slipped the plans into his satchel. Or maybe they'd placed the satchel itself where they knew he wouldn't find it for decades, tucked deep behind unused conduit reels and rusted cable trays. Out of sight until time or necessity forced it back into the light. Later that evening, he told his nephew, Eric, a municipal contracting supervisor with a quiet network of city contacts. Eric didn't overreact. He didn't suggest going public. Instead, he offered to show the documents discreetly to someone he trusted in state compliance. A friend who worked in infrastructure archives, with access to old permits and fire reports. They scanned the diagrams, sent a copy of the Polaroid. Calvin signed nothing, used no email. The exchange was analog, deliberate, and quiet. Neither of them said it aloud, but they understood. If the materials were legitimate, if the annotations matched something in the original investigation, then what had once been dismissed as an electrical malfunction might be something else, entirely something buried. And the first breath of that truth had surfaced not through confession or forensic discovery, but through the quiet act of cleaning out a basement after 40 years. The diagrams arrived at the New Jersey State Compliance Office in late July 2023, bundled in a courier envelope marked Infrastructure Archive Inquiry, Legacy Wiring. To anyone processing intake, the contents seemed routine. Old electrical schematics for a long-demolished building, submitted for record reconciliation, but within hours, a staff technician flagged the envelope for internal review. The name on the building's original permit caught his attention: Lincoln Heights Federal Credit Union. The fire had been old news, but not unknown. It was one of several flagged cases from the 1980s where structural destruction aligned suspiciously with high-value insurance payouts. Nothing had ever come of it, but internal auditors had whispered about the payout. Now, almost 4 decades later, the submission wasn't coming from a law firm or investigator. It came from a man named Calvin Drayton, attached with a note that read simply, "These documents were found in a retired electrician's personal archive. The annotations are not original. Please review burn pattern from 1986 incident." The schematics were high-resolution scans of the original building plans, but they bore additions yellow highlighter traces running alongside standard panel feeds, clearly added after the fact. The annotations outlined how to reroute electrical loads through a buried subpanel, bypassing the fire alarm's fail-safe loop and leaving the system armed in appearance but inert in function. The added notes were precise, almost surgical. Whoever made them had intimate knowledge of the alarm circuitry. More telling was the reference to RT-27 keycut, a shorthand not found in any public specification sheet but recognizable to seasoned systems techs as a relay timer override. The notation suggested someone had timed the disarmament of the alarm system, likely to coincide with the bank's closing, when building access would still be routine and unguarded. Investigators quietly retrieved the original 1986 fire report from storage. When compared side by side, the annotated schematics aligned almost exactly with a burn pattern observed in the building's northeast utility corridor. A specific feed previously assumed to have failed under load had, in fact, been rerouted in the exact path now outlined in the yellow markup. The fire's origin point, the overheating of conduit behind panel 3B, now appeared intentional. It was not just an overload. It had been staged. The implications were immediate and unsettling. Someone had altered the building's wiring in a way that caused a controlled failure, a failure masked as accident. And the only reason anyone had found the truth now was because the modified plans had surfaced in a private satchel, untouched for nearly 40 years. The materials were forwarded to internal fraud and legacy investigations. A name was pulled from the annotations: Leon G. A trace began quietly, and without notification to local departments. If the fire had been staged to erase a theft, and if the schematics were real, then this was no longer a matter of forgotten infrastructure. It was the first viable lead in a cold case thought long closed. The Polaroid was grainy, but clear. A dark duffel bag sat unzipped on a linoleum floor, its sides sagging under the weight of bundled cash. Each bundle was marked with the standard Federal Reserve strap, color-coded, denomination labeled, and slightly askew from transport. The edges of the bills were worn, suggesting circulation. But the straps were clean, unused. The money had been collected, not issued. There was no human subject in the frame. No visible timestamp, though a faded corner suggested an automatic date imprint once existed. The lighting was soft, ambient, possibly from a window or overhead fluorescence. And behind the bag, in partial view, a baseboard with chipped paint beige over white and a faint discoloration along the wall, as though furniture had recently been moved. The flooring was key. Investigators noted the pattern: faux stone vinyl tile, common in mid-century kitchens and basement apartments. But this pattern gray interlock with pink speck had been discontinued in 1984. A database of municipal housing records flagged 5 Newark area structures still noted for that specific flooring in the late 1980s. Only 2 of them had basements matching the probable ceiling clearance visible in the photograph's top edge. Both properties were listed as rentals. One of them had been registered under a tenant named Leon Gervais in September 1986. The coincidence was chilling. State compliance officers requested a scan of the physical photograph. Their image techs confirmed that it was genuine. The emulsion matrix and dye stability were consistent with Polaroid 600 series film used between 1982 and 1990. There were no signs of digital manipulation, no post-print overlays. Whatever the origin, the photo was not recent. It had been developed when analog cameras still ruled. Investigators began constructing a timeline. The cash in the photo was real. The straps and denominations matched Brink's transport records from August 1986. The bag itself, black canvas with dual zippers and a side tag, matched standard gym duffels sold throughout the early 80s. It was generic, but functional, portable, unremarkable. Ideal for discreet transport. And then there was the question of how it got into Calvin Drayton's possession. The photo had not been casually stored. It was sealed in an envelope buried beneath electrical plans, tucked inside a bag behind conduit reels, untouched since the Reagan administration. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it, not destroy it, but preserve it in silence. For law enforcement, the implications were stark. If the duffel held even a portion of the 2.1 million reported destroyed in the Lincoln Heights fire, then the fire had not been an accident. It had been the final act in a theft, a meticulously planned inside job hidden beneath bureaucratic ash. The photo, for the first time in 37 years, gave that theory an anchor, a location, a time frame, and a name. The money hadn't burned. It had been bagged, photographed, and somehow left behind for someone eventually to find. Eric Drayton understood discretion. As a municipal contractor, he knew how easily a misplaced document or overheard conversation could derail a sensitive lead. The materials Calvin had unearthed weren't just curious. They implicated a deliberate crime buried under 4 decades of institutional inaction. There would be no press conference, no dramatic reveal. Only quiet channels, steady hands, and careful verification. Eric's first call was to Marcus Ellery, a senior compliance analyst with the State Infrastructure Archive. They had worked adjacent projects before zoning compliance, municipal retrofits, and Ellery had a reputation for knowing what to flag and what to forget. Eric asked to meet in person. They sat down at a diner in East Orange on a Wednesday morning. Eric brought a duplicate set of the schematics and a high-resolution scan of the photograph. No originals, no identifying addresses. He laid them out on the table between the coffee mugs and watched Ellery's eyes track the yellow annotations. "Whoever did this," Ellery said after a long silence, "they knew exactly where to hit it. He didn't ask for names, he just took the materials and promised quiet circulation." Within 48 hours, the documents had been routed to the New Jersey State Forensic Archive under an existing flag, a dormant fire case tagged as unresolved with unusual payout ratios. From there, a copy of the 1986 Lincoln Heights fire report was pulled. The burn pattern diagram was already digitized. The match was instant. Ellery called Eric with the result, but asked him not to say anything further, not even to Calvin, until it moved through internal review. If this reopened a dormant case, it had to be airtight. Speculation, if leaked, could compromise everything. Meanwhile, Eric returned the satchel to Calvin with quiet instructions. "Keep it locked, don't handle the contents more than necessary." and under no circumstances mention Leon Gervais or the photograph to anyone outside the loop. Calvin agreed. He hadn't told a soul beyond Eric and didn't plan to. His only goal, he said, was to know if I had something to do with it, even by accident. Behind closed doors, Ellery drafted an interdepartmental memorandum, not for law enforcement, not yet, but for Internal Audit Liaison Group 3A, which handled legacy asset misappropriation. The language was clinical. Historic circuit diagrams and recovered image material suggest premeditated tampering with alarm systems at LHF facility prior to fire loss incident of August 1986. Recommending reclassification to suspected fraudulent destruction and internal theft. The memo went unsigned for 2 days. Then, a red marker flagged the name Leon G., cross-referenced with employment records from 1986. The system returned one match. Leon Gervais, janitorial subcontractor, Lincoln Heights Federal Credit Union, hired spring '86, last paycheck issued August honest. Never reported for duty after August 5. No resignation, no forwarding address. It was the break no one had expected. A name frozen in clerical history had resurfaced, tied now not only to a photograph and a schematic, but to the physical evidence the fire investigators had missed. And the wheels, slow but certain, began to turn again. In early August 2023, state forensic archivists convened in a quiet conference room at the Bureau of Legacy Investigations. Under fluorescent lights, they spread 3 documents across a long table: the 1986 burn pattern diagram, the original breaker panel schematic, and the yellow highlighted wiring plans from Calvin Drayton's satchel. A digital overlay linked each point of interest, pixel by pixel, as the lead analyst Marisol Vargas magnified sections on a large monitor. Vargas began with the burn pattern diagram drawn by Ellis Conroy in 1986. The Northeast utility, corridor labeled Panel 3B Feed, in red ink, showed an atypical concentration of flame vectors along conduit runs marked Circuit A. On the schematic, Circuit A was the vault alarm feed, a straightforward, direct line to the Honeywell control unit. Its documented failure had been attributed to overload. Next came Calvin's annotated copy. The yellow tracing diverged from the canonical route. Instead of running along the main hallway, it dipped through a service hatch and looped behind an auxiliary subpanel labeled RT-27. Vargas pointed to a hand-scrawled note beside that loop, keycut override 10, 5 p.m., and compared it to Conroy's time, stamped photo captions. Both matched. The engineered overload incident occurred precisely at 10:05 p.m. on August 8. On screen, Vargas superimposed the 2 diagrams. The highlighted path aligned exactly with the burn vectors, down to a minor kink behind a load-bearing beam that most architects would never sketch. A collective hush fell over the room as the implication sank in. This was not coincidence. It was blueprint accuracy. Dr. Alan Chu, a retired fire pattern specialist brought in as a consultant, reviewed the overlay. He tapped his pen on the table. In my 30 years, I've never seen such a direct, unambiguous correlation between post-fire damage and an after-the-fact wiring plan, he said. This is about as close to a smoking gun as you can get without finding accelerant residue. The team documented each correspondence with screen captures and high-resolution prints. On-screen text, overlays drafted by Vargas, annotated the matching coordinates. Point on, 41 grout, conduit burn origin. Annotation X, yellow highlight aligns. Deviation noted. Even the margin handwriting, the slight tilt of the capital R in RT-27, was identified as unique, suggesting a single author for the annotations and the keycut note. By the end of the session, the Bureau formally reclassified the Lincoln Heights incident. What had once been labeled electrical malfunction, became suspected malicious ignition coincident with asset misappropriation. A motion passed to transfer all files' original reports, photographs, and now Calvin's satchel contento, the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice, for a full cold case reinvestigation. In a final, understated act, Vargas logged into the state's secure case tracking portal and updated the case status, Lin 1986 FH, reopened. No announcement was issued. There were no press releases. But in that unmarked change, 4 decades of official silence fractured. The schematic matched silent, yellow, and meticulous had spoken for itself, and the first tangible lead in 37 years was now in the hands of detectives. In the state's personnel files, Leon Gervais was little more than a footnote. Hired as a subcontracted night janitor on May 12, 1986, his pay stubs showed consistent hours through July. His last recorded clock-in was on August honest. 2 days later, he never swiped the keycard again. No resignation letter, no exit interview. Just a deserted locker with a half-empty thermos and a pair of work gloves. The payroll department marked him unresponsive and closed the file in September. Routine attrition, they assumed, in a seasonal role. Detective Mara Singh first encountered the name in a dusty ledger pulled from the Division of Criminal Justice archive. When she saw Leon G. beside RT 27 keycut, her pulse quickened. Within hours, she'd requested Gervais's personnel folder, photocopied his ID photo, and noted the way his shoulders were hunched in the grainy black and white print, an awkward pose for a man whose work was meant to go unnoticed. Singh traced his last known address to a boarded-up duplex on 9th Avenue. The tax assessor's records showed the owner as a local absentee landlord. Gervais's employer covered rent until August 5, then stopped. Neighbors interviewed decades later recalled a quiet man who kept odd hours, often carrying a lunch pail and a coil of extension cord. No one remembered him being a talkative neighbor or a friend. He arrived in the evenings, left at dawn, and then vanished. A search of old utility records uncovered a different detail. The duplex had an auxiliary fuse panel installed behind the kitchen wall alone, identical to the RT-27 module in the Lincoln Heights plans. It was obscure, used mostly in light industrial retrofits, and the installer's permit was signed by Stokes Electrical Services, the same contractor Calvin Drayton had worked for. The coincidence wasn't lost on Singh. Gervais had both the motive and the means to study the panel's layout up close. Singh obtained a warrant to enter the vacant property. She found the subpanel untouched in place, dust-caked but intact. Beneath it, on the concrete floor, was a faint scorch mark, no larger than a handprint, but unmistakable. It matched the partial charring on the schematics RT-27 loop. On the back of the panel cover, someone had handwritten Leon G. in ballpoint ink, the same handwriting style identified in the yellow highlights. Back at headquarters, Singh compared the ink strokes from the panel to the annotations in Calvin's diagrams. The tilt of the G matched. The slight flourish on the terminal 7 was identical. It was a signature written not on paper but in wiring and, now on metal. Forensic ink analysts confirmed the probability of a single author. At 1,722 hours on August 15, 2023, the division issued a missing person of interest bulletin for Leon Gervais. A man unmoored in time, possibly in witness protection, possibly in anonymity. His disappearance had been his cover. His fingerprints on the schematics were his undoing. And through careful tracing of a name long buried, detectives finally had a focal point to pursue the man who might hold the key to the $2.1 million that never burned. By mid-August 2023, Detective Mara Singh's case file brimmed with cross-referenced evidence. The annotated schematics, burn pattern overlays, the scrawled Leon G. on the auxiliary panel, and Calvin Drayton's satchel documents. Sitting before a pinboard in her Newark office, Singh began to stitch together the events of that August night in 1986. On-screen text overlay, archival permit. July 20, 1986 RT, 27 auxiliary panel installed, 203 Brighton St. She traced the sequence. In late July 1986, Leon Gervais, employed as a night janitor, noticed the auxiliary panel behind a kitchen wall at his rented duplex. Its configuration matched the vault alarm circuitry at Lincoln Heights Federal. Over subsequent weeks, Gervais took detailed mental notes as he cleaned the building nightly, mapping feed paths between the breaker room and the Honeywell control unit in the utility corridor. On-screen cut to thermal blueprint. A yellow highlight shows the RT-27 circuit linking panel 3B to the vault alarm feed. Sometime during the first week of August, Gervais bypassed the factory wiring by inserting a concealed relay timer within the auxiliary panel programmed to override the alarm at precisely 10:05 p.m. on August 8. That timing aligned with branch closing procedures. Tellers would secure the vault, turn off lights, and leave, believing the alarm still active. On-screen text overlay, Brinks transmittal. August 8, 1986, 2 p.m., funds secured in vault. With the alarm silently disarmed, the perpetrator, likely Gervais, entered through the service stairwell, unlocked the vault using the duplicated keys from keycut arrangements, and removed $2.1 million in small bills. The Polaroid evidence suggests the cash was photographed immediately, perhaps as proof of haul or to plan distribution. Bundles were then stashed in a duffel bag and loaded onto an unmarked vehicle. On-screen cut. 2. Broken lock schematic. The vault door found open but unbreached. With the money secured, Gervais and accomplice activated a timed incendiary device within the breaker panel. At 10:05 p.m., the relay heated a critical feed, triggering an engineered overload and igniting the utility corridor. The fire advanced rapidly, obscuring forensic traces and ensuring the vault's interior would be assumed destroyed by flames. Archival photo. Fire investigators. Charred conduit behind panel 3B, matching schematic traces. By dawn, Newark firefighters declared electrical malfunction, unaware that the sequence had been executed with blueprint precision. The building was demolished weeks later, the evidence buried beneath rubble and bureaucratic closure. Detective Singh pinned a final note to the board. Motive: inside knowledge. Method: circuit manipulation. Cover: total loss. A slow exhale filled the room. The reconstructed timeline, built from faded documents and a single yellow highlight, cast the fire not as accident, but as the culminating act of a meticulously planned theft. And as the silent echo of that night reverberated through 4 decades, Singh recognized that the true crime had been masked by procedural apathy, and only a retired electrician's forgotten satchel had awakened its memory. Detective Mara Singh's reconstruction painted a clear picture of Leon Gervais's orchestration, but one question still hovered in the Newark office and in Calvin Drayton's mind. To what extent had Calvin himself been implicated? He had wired the building. His blueprints bore the original design. Yet the annotated satchel suggested another hand at work, someone who knew the plans but deliberately manipulated them. Calvin sat in his modest living room, sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds, as his nephew Eric explained the developing case. Eric's voice was measured, almost reassuring, but the implication was stark. Calvin's documentation had been co-opted, not as a willing participant, but as an unwitting accomplice. Those yellow highlights had not been his. He had never met Leon Gervais. Yet the plans he'd drafted, drawn up under Stokes' electrical service shed, had become a blueprint for crime. He remembered entering the bank in late 1985, bundled against winter cold, cable in hand, conduit clamps jingling. Work moved quickly. Splice. Test. Secure. The building passed inspection, The alarm lines were calibrated, handshakes, final sign-offs, and a check in his hand. He never saw any of the RT-27 relays. He never saw anything out of place. His role ended in compliance with code. Now, decades later, he felt a quiet relief that the manipulated notes were not his, but an unsettling guilt that his own work had been exploited. In informational hearings, state investigators assured him there was no evidence linking his actions to the theft. They spoke in gentle tones. Calvin was a key to solving the case, not a suspect. But guilt has its own logic. It resists explanation. Back in Singh's office, forensic analysts confirmed that the original documents bore only his inked circuit labels and standard notations. The yellow highlights were applied in a different medium highlighter ink, not manufactured until the 1990s. Photomicrographs showed the highlight strokes overlaid atop aged pencil lines, indicating a later edition. Calvin's handwriting samples dated from Social Security forms, and union cards matched the base legends, but not the annotations. Singh closed the file on Calvin's possible involvement. He was a witness, a catalyst even, but not a conspirator. She drafted a letter of acknowledgement to Calvin. Your discovery and submission of these materials were instrumental in reopening and resolving the historic incident. No evidence suggests your knowledge of or involvement in the events of 1986 beyond the professional execution of contracted electrical work. When the letter arrived, Calvin read it aloud to his wife Miriam, whose eyes brimmed with quiet pride. He closed it gently and set it atop his electrical ledger, now a relic among many. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe he was free of complicity. His memory of wiring that cold basement corridor was that of a craftsman, not a collaborator. Yet as he sat back, the gentle creak of floorboards beneath his feet reminded him of the cost. A life's work unwittingly weaponized, and only the passing of time and his own persistence had revealed the truth. In the hush of his living room, Calvin faced the paradox of innocence proven and legacy transformed by a crime he never knew existed. Detective Mara Singh leaned over her desk as the digital map of Newark flickered to life on the wall-mounted monitor. Each pin represented a lead in Leon Gervais's vanished years, an alias, a property transaction, a cryptic financial record. The first cluster of pins centered on the 9th Avenue duplex, but beyond that there was little solid ground. No confirmed sightings, no arrest records, only the faint echo of a name that time had tried to swallow. On-screen text overlay, property ledger, 1986, 1988, 9th Avenue, Newark renter, Leon Gervais. The lease ended abruptly. Singh discovered that the absentee landlord had sold the duplex in 1989 to a company called Meridian Holdings, registered offshore. No officers named Leon G. appeared in the filing. A correspondence trail suggested Meridian purchased other distressed properties, all within a 3-mile radius of the credit union. Each deal closed quickly and quietly, often just weeks after unexplained structural fires or insurance payouts. Singh's team followed the money questions next. Federal banking records obtained through a sealed subpoena, a dormant account opened in late 1986 under the name Leonard Grant. It held a single deposit of $250, then nothing. The account was closed in 1994 with a final balance of $248,700. There was no withdrawal slip on file, no sign of the remaining $1.85 million. On-screen cut to bank manifest excerpt. Deposit 8/15/1986 $250 reference. L. Grant. Meridian Holdings' shell documents hinted at other fronts: a convenience store in Elizabeth, an auto repair shop in Irvington. Both were shuttered by 1992. Investigators obtained blueprints for the store's back room and found an auxiliary panel eerily similar to RT-27, suggesting a pattern. Singh noted that wherever Gervais or someone acting in his stead landed, they sought discrete spaces with low traffic and unconventional fuse setups. But the trail went cold again. Local contacts reported no confirmed sightings of Leonard Grant or Leon Gervais past the early 90s. No death certificate, no obituary, no Social Security trace beyond 1,996. It was as though he had stepped off the grid entirely. Singh convened a meeting with financial crime specialists. They theorized that Gervais may have laundered portions of the stolen cash through multiple micro-deposits or real estate flips, never consolidating large sums in a single institution. The 250 deposit could have been an initial test run, a way to secure a hidden nest egg. The remainder may have been dispersed in bearer bonds, cash-stashed safe houses, or funneled through unregulated dealers. On-screen text overlay. Investigators note. Suspect adept at exploiting legacy infrastructure loopholes, parallel wiring as metaphor for parallel identities. As weeks passed, Singh's team mapped out 5 potential safe house locations: basements, service tunnels, subdivided garages matching the irregular panel configurations Gervais had favored. Each site was subject to warrantless sweeps, with scant results, some old wiring panels, a few unclaimed deposit boxes, but no trove of missing funds. In the quiet hum of her office, Singh stared at the map, dotted with empty promises. The financial trail was murky, obscured by decades of shell companies and offshore registrations. Yet each dead end underscored the audacity of the original crime, a theft so clean that the money's fate was as anonymous as its architect. Still, she thought, every pin was a testament to persistence. Each search, each subpoena peeled back another layer of the labyrinth Gervais had built. The money might never be found, but the path he carved through fuse loops, bank ledgers, and ghostly properties was laid bare. The stolen millions remained a phantom, but the trail, once silent, now stretched across the decades in legitimate daylight. By late September 2023, the New Jersey Division of Criminal Justice had formally reclassified the 1986 Lincoln Heights fire as a case of suspected malicious ignition and asset misappropriation. An internal bulletin notified Newark PD detectives and county prosecutors that the file was reopened, with Leon Gervais named as the prime person of interest. Though no arrests had been made, the public record now reflected a shift. What was once logged as an accident now carried the weight of intentional crime. Detective Mara Singh arranged a final interview with Calvin Drayton at the State Forensic Archive in Trenton. The room was spare. A rectangular table, 4 chairs, and cabinets of case files lining the walls. A single document lay between them: Singh's memorandum, acknowledging Calvin's indispensable role as a witness and clearing him of suspicion. Calvin, wearing a plain gray sweater and holding a leather-bound notebook, listened as Singh reviewed the case chronology. She spoke evenly, her tone factual but not cold. "Mr. Drayton, your discovery of those schematics and that photograph changed everything. Without them, this case would have remained closed." She slid a copy of the reclassification memo across the table. On-screen text overlays the memo's opening line. Effective 9/27/2023 case, line 1986 FH, reclassified to malicious ignition with theft. Calvin nodded. His hands folded in his lap. His nephew Eric sat quietly behind him, arms crossed. The room smelled faintly of old paper and varnish. For the first time, Calvin allowed himself to see the full arc of the investigation, from the day he found the satchel in his basement to the moment the state updated its own findings. "I never imagined these papers would lead here," he said softly. "I just didn't want to throw them out." His voice carried a trace of wonder mingled with relief. He glanced at the yellow highlights on the preserved blueprint sheet displayed in a protective sleeve. "It feels like finding a loose thread in an old coat pullet, and the whole seam unravels." Singh leaned back. "That's exactly what happened. You pulled the thread." She paused, her gaze steady. "We may never recover the cash, but we've given the case a name, a focus, and a story that was buried for decades. That matters." Outside the glass window of the interview room, folders lined metal carts waiting to be sent back to archives. For Calvin, each cart represented layers of forgotten truths now rediscovered. He pictured the credit union's charred remains on Brighton Street now, a parking lot no different than any other, and felt that the memory of those flames had finally been given shape. In the weeks that followed, a quiet notice appeared in the Newark Star-Ledger's legal notices, an announcement of case reopening, and an appeal for information leading to Leon Gervais's whereabouts or the missing funds. There was no front-page coverage, no sensational headlines, only a sober paragraph buried on page blank 12, marked Legal Reclassification, noting that inquiries could be directed to the Division of Criminal Justice. Calvin read it one morning over coffee. He marked the article with a tidy pen circle, then closed his newspaper and sat back. The case's public reckoning was small, but it existed. In the hush of his living room, he reflected on how a forgotten satchel left in darkness for nearly 40 years had finally illuminated the hidden hands behind that night's fire. The stolen millions remained elusive, but their story would no longer be dismissed as ash and silence. In that unassuming newspaper notice, and in the quiet assurances he'd received, Calvin found an unexpected vindication for both the past and his own place within it. In the months following the case's quiet reclassification, Newark moved on much as it always did. The municipal parking lot on Brighton Street remained unchanged, anonymous under streetlights and commuter cars. But behind the scenes, legacy files once sealed gathered digital dust no more. Each PDF scan of Ellis Conroy's burn diagrams, each high-resolution image of Calvin Drayton's yellow highlighted schematics, and that single Polaroid of bundled cash now existed in perpetuity within secure cloud archive tokens of a truth once smothered by silence. On-screen text overlay, archive directory, Linen 980, 6FH artifacts, 1. Conroy burn diagram, 2. Drayton annotated schematics, 3. Polaroid evidence, 4. Gervais panel cover. A year later, in autumn 2024, the Bureau of Legacy Investigations hosted a closed symposium on cold case reopenings. Among the presenters was Marisol Vargas, who outlined the blueprint effect, how a single set of modified plans could recalibrate an entire investigation. She spoke of procedural inertia, of how buried evidence often outlives institutional memory, and how the deliberate act of preservation in this case, an electrician's satchel, became a catalyst for justice deferred. Calvin Drayton did not attend. He continued to live in his Ellington Avenue home, now with railings installed to ease stair navigation. His basement, once a chaotic mesh of tools and debris, had been organized into labeled storage, personal archives, workshop equipment, seasonal supplies. The satchel, emptied and preserved under archival mylar, rested in a climate-controlled box on a high shelf, its contents, digitized, cataloged, and time-stamped. Late one evening, as he sorted wiring spools under a single bare bulb, Calvin paused. He ran his fingers along the satchel's frayed seam. A quiet thought surfaced. Decades ago, he had carried that bag without knowing its import. It had traveled from job site to basement, through years of neglect, until time itself forced it into view. He realized then that what was left, behind evidence, memory, questions, can remain dormant until circumstance grants it breath. Visual cut to faded document. A close-up of the original Union Local 456 timesheet from December 1985, Calvin's signature ink almost blurred by age. In the broader narrative of Newark's history, the Lincoln Heights fire remained a footnote. Yet for every arson report and insurance payout logged in leather-bound volumes, there now stood an addendum, technical corrigendum to the official record. It read, simply, cause, malicious ignition orchestrated via tampered circuitry, theft of assets confirmed. case reopened. No grand ceremonies marked its inclusion. No marble plaque commemorated the discovery. Instead, the legacy endured in digital files, in the quiet pride of one man who chose not to discard a satchel, and in a system that finally listened to the faint echo of a blueprint. In the hush of the archive servers and the shadows of memory, Calvin found solace. The silence that once concealed a crime had transformed into a conduit for truth. And in that transformation, something profound remained. The knowledge that even the smallest item, a folded diagram, a yellowed photo, a worn canvas bag, can hold within it the power to unravel decades of obscurity and restore the narrative of justice long denied.